If you consider yourself to be a car enthusiast, I have a question for you. When was the last time that you drove a new car? And I'm not talking about anything fancy here, even a bare bones economy car that's less than 2 years old. Because I think many of us that are super deep down the automotive rabbit hole that don't get a lot of opportunities to drive different vehicles, we often kind of scoff at non-car enthusiasts who choose to drive normal new cars. And partially that's because we have an emotional connection to our older cars, and we just don't see how anyone could justify spending the tens of thousands of dollars it costs to drive a newer model. We often complain that new cars are just not that engaging to drive, about how there are too many screens or annoying safety features, or how we think our 20-year-old model is just as reliable as any new car on sale today. But as a hardcore car enthusiast who just did 350 miles in maybe one of the most boring cars on sale today in the form of the Nissan Sentra, I have to tell you, I was very pleasantly surprised. Now, to start us off, I was not driving this Nissan Sentra by choice. And if it was totally up to me, I'd much rather have taken my Subaru BRZ for this road trip. What really prompted this was a couple weeks ago, my BRZ got hit. Now, luckily the damage was pretty minor and I wasn't in the car when it happened, so I am certainly thankful for that. How it ended up happening is that at my current apartment, I have to park my car on the street. And it is a relatively tight street with traffic flowing in both directions with lots of driveways. So finding a spot can be a little bit of a challenge. But regardless of that, on the night of October 10th, I found a spot, parked my car, and the next morning when I came out at about like 7 a.m. to go to the gym, I always kind of give my car a quick once over before I get in, and I noticed that the front end had been hit. It resulted in some pretty deep scratches on the bumper, as well as dents and scratches on the hood and a bashed in headlight. And unfortunately, the person who did it did not leave a note or any other indication that they had hit my car, other than the fact that the front end was bashed up. Obviously here I was pretty upset at the time, and immediately I was debating whether it would be worth it to file a claim with my insurance. Now, to be honest, I've had this car now for over 4 years, and during that time it has accumulated a whole bunch of like minor dents and scratches, and that was while I had off-street parking. So my thought was that with parking on the street now, it's only going to continue to get more and more beat up and kind of rough around the edges. So with this new damage, I could potentially just try to buff out the scratches as well as I could and put a new headlight on the car. But when shopping for that new headlight, I realized that a OEM headlight from Subaru is basically the same price as my deductible, and I've never filed a claim before. I pay for good insurance, so I just went ahead and put in a claim. So a few days later, my car went into the body shop, and fortunately with my job and where I live, I really don't need a car on like a day-to-day basis. But with that said, I did have a weekend trip planned, so I ended up having to get a rental. Now again, I was pretty lucky here because I had rental coverage through my insurance, but it only covers like $30 a day. And I have experience with rental cars because I did an internship at Enterprise Rent-A-Car between my junior and senior years of college. So I know $30 is basically just going to get you the cheapest car on the lot. So when I ended up going to pick up the car, I was given a 2024 Nissan Sentra with around 11,000 miles, which actually was like the exact car that I was expecting to get. And by all definitions, the Nissan Sentra is not a nice car. Now, during that summer internship, I learned that Nissans make up like a very large portion of the enterprise rental car fleet, and largely I found them to be really unpleasant to drive. And that was about 6 years ago, but I assumed the same would hold true. This car was going to be slow, it was going to be noisy, and it was going to be uncomfortable. But I was dead wrong. Before we get into the details on that, I just want to briefly talk about the type of driving I was doing in this car. I mentioned in the intro that I did about 350 miles in this car over the course of 3 days. Of that driving, about 280 of those miles were spent on the highway getting to and from my parents' house. Another 40 of those miles were spent on a very pleasant drive down a back road in a state forest. And then the remaining 30 miles were just kind of spent running errands around town. And considering all of those different types of driving, I think it really does provide a good foundation to evaluate this car. So to start us off, where this car excelled, it was just driving around town. Truly, for like short trips, quick errands, the Nissan Sentra is excellent. The CVT transmission was pretty smooth under acceleration, and the tiny 4-cylinder engine surprisingly provided as much torque as I would ever need pulling away from a stoplight. And Boston is certainly not known for having good streets, and I was pretty much dodging potholes everywhere I went. But I would say overall, the ride was pretty adequate. Where the Sentra ended up struggling a little bit was on the highway. This is where that tiny 1.6 liter 4-cylinder engine and the CVT transmission just started to show some of their inherent flaws. Getting up to highway speeds means that you have to have a pretty heavy right foot, which means that that little tiny engine is revving to the moon, and because it's a CVT, it basically just picks 1 RPM and sits there. But once you get up to those highway speeds, it really wasn't that bad. At 70 miles an hour, the RPMs come back down and you're pretty much just able to cruise. There were like a few little awkward instances that I noticed where, say you're at 20% throttle and the engine is turning over at 2000 RPM. You dip into the throttle just a little bit more, literally going from 20 to 21% throttle, and the RPMs jump from 2000 up to 3500 and sit there. But if you ease off the throttle just a little bit and go back down to that 20% that you were at before, the RPMs instantly drop back down to 2000. And you could just kind of go back and forth, just barely edging into the throttle. Mainly, I think this is a quirk of the CVT transmission, because with a conventional automatic, I think it might hold that gear a little bit longer as you dipped into the throttle. And then in the case that it upshifted, it would then hold that gear a little bit longer, which would just be overall a lot smoother. But I don't want to harp too much here, because other than that, the car performed really well. The cabin was well insulated from both road noise and the noise of the engine. The ride was, again, pretty decent. And not to mention that the car averaged 35 miles per gallon on the highway. Where the Nissan Sentra felt the most out of place was with that back road drive. And this should not come as too much of a surprise, because this is not a performance car. And to be fair, just about any car that doesn't have some type of performance focus was probably going to be a letdown here. This was without a doubt the part of my trip where I missed my BRZ the most. I primarily drive around the city with my BRZ, so like getting true back road driving is kind of hard to come by. Driving the Sentra, the CVT was certainly a pain point where you basically had no idea where the RPMs were going to go next. The skinny eco-focused front tires meant that the limits of grip were incredibly low, like very easily overcome by any type of spirited driving. The car also just generally felt pretty unsettled and had super light steering, but again, performance driving is not the focus of this car. Now, this video is not intended to be a review of the Sentra specifically. I more so just want to kind of talk about some of the common traits that you can expect in this new economy car segment. But before we do, I just want to circle back around and remind you of kind of my own personal frame of reference. My daily driver is a 2016 Subaru BRZ with about 90,000 miles. And even when that car was new, it was not a leader in things like features or comfort. Even in stock form, the BRZ's ride is pretty rough. The infotainment feels dated, and there is a lot of road and engine noise that makes it into the cabin. But in my day-to-day driving, those are sacrifices that I am willing to make in the sake of engagement and performance. So to loop back around to the Sentra, if I just kind of had to sum up my thoughts with this car, it was just a lot nicer than I expected. And by nicer, I mean things like interior noise. Very little road noise or engine noise makes it into the cabin by comparison to my BRZ. And also, because it's a new car, even a cheap new car, there are very few kind of creaks and rattles that you just kind of get used to when you're driving an older model. Additionally, the infotainment system was great. This was my first time doing a substantial amount of driving in a car that has Apple CarPlay, and I'll be honest, it's making me debate whether I want to retrofit that into my car. And again, to circle back around to the Sentra's ride quality, I found it to be totally serviceable, and it reminded me how well kind of normal pedestrian cars drive by comparison to either older or modified sports cars. Another point, something that you often hear from car enthusiasts, is complaining about all of the driver assist features that come in new cars. They were not invasive in the slightest. Now, admittedly, this is a bare bones economy car, so it's not going to have the latest and greatest features in terms of driver assist tech, but I'll say things like the blind spot monitoring were certainly appreciated. I also didn't have any false activations of the emergency braking system, which was a pretty common problem when this tech first started rolling out and I was driving cars at Enterprise. The one kind of inconvenience that I did have was a flare-up of the lane keep assist, where I was going through an intersection where it had lanes that diverged. I continued straight, and the car kind of gave me a warning message and had 3 good pumps of the brake, which definitely caught me by surprise. But other than that, I really didn't have any other problems, and I will certainly take that trade-off if it means I get things like radar cruise control or blind spot monitoring. And lastly, there is just kind of a sense of security that you feel driving a new car and kind of feeling like it's less likely to have a major mechanical failure. Now, that's not to say that new Nissans are going to be the most reliable cars on the road, but with no weird noises, no weird smells, you just kind of feel like the car is less likely to break down. My overall point here being, if you are somebody that loves older cars but criticize people who choose to drive newer, cheaper models, I think you might be missing the point. New cars today, even economy cars, have just gotten really good. They are smooth, quiet, reliable, and efficient. And if you are somebody that is just looking for transportation, it is certainly a better choice compared to a 10-year-old used sports car.